How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Eye Hobby Time. My wife and I just got back from a little trip around the Rockies, where we saw some incredible sights, including the geysers of Yellowstone, the grizzly bear and Grand Tetons, and the cliff palace of Mesa Verde National Park, the last of which is the inspiration for today's build. These miniatures that I'll be using today came with a coat of mold release that I did my best to remove with a toothbrush and a bath of dish soap, which worked fairly well. I rinsed them all with isopropyl alcohol as well, just for good measure. Once all of the miniatures were dry, I glued them to some painting bases and I took them outside to prime. But before we paint those, let's move on to the rest of the diorama. I started the diorama with a 10-inch by 20-inch gesso board and sketched on the layout of the Cliff Palace using this image that I found online as a reference. I sketched the whole palace to fit the proportions of the board, but it definitely wouldn't have been in the correct scale per my miniatures to fit everything. So I adjusted the scale a bit, and I decided to fit just about half of the full thing. I built up the base using layers of XPS insulation and blocked out the general stratified landscape that sits inside the cave that the structures will sit on. After stacking up and gluing all of the foam, I had a little bit of overhang on all of the sides, so I cleaned that up with my hot wire table. Once the sides were nice and clean, I switched to my handheld hot wire to carve away some of the volume, and then I switched to my handheld utility knife to remove the rest. There are a variety of structures in this palace, and most of the round ones are made from this cardboard roll that I cut into a bunch of little pieces off camera on my bandsaw. The larger round structures, called kivas, were made from a matcha whisk box, and the rest of the structures are made from thin layers of foam that I cut on my hot wire table. In full transparency, I started this thing with hopes of creating the exact layout building for building of the actual Cliff Palace, but ended up creating my own layout that looks very similar, fits the dimensions of this base. The exact layout is a little confusing to me, given the stratification of the palace and the way that the structures are stacked one on top of the other. It's hard to tell where one began and one ended, and I couldn't find a good reference for how the city looked in its prime. I tried to use a lot of the same designs, though, as the original. Place structures generally in the same way, but the one thing now that I'm looking at it that is probably inaccurate is the long staircases that I added. One defining feature that stood out to me while I was at the Cliff Palace was the keyhole windows that would have been used as entrances via ladder. I made sure to add a few of those around the city. Another element of this landmark that I couldn't quite capture with this diorama was the depth of the cave and how far back the buildings actually go into it. To imply this, though, I made a bunch of false fronts to sit along the back wall. Something I learned while I was at the palace is that in its prime, it would have housed around 120 people. This number is based off the number of kivas that exist on the site. These are the structures with fire for cooking and heating and would have likely been the center of activity for each family unit. Many of these would have been accessed from the top down, being climbed down into via a ladder, hence the cutouts on a few of these roofs. After all of the buildings were in position, I cut up some little bits of styrene to make the visible ends of the beams that will hold up the roofs and floors in the adobe style. I made way more than I actually needed. After gluing the little styrene bits everywhere they were needed, it was time to finish the rest of the cave and slap a roof on this bad boy. I cut up some large pieces of foam to act as the vertical walls, the back and the side of the cave, and then I began filling in all the plain flat walls that I hadn't carved with foam rocks to make it look a little bit more natural. I opted for foam rocks instead of plaster rocks because I ran out of plaster rocks and I have so much foam excess I thought I might as well use some of it. Once all the unnaturally flat surfaces had been covered with equally unnatural foam rocks, I put the large sandstone cover on the top that I made off camera. After that, it was time to fill some gaps. My spackle had acquired a mystery liquid, so after reincorporating that, I began surfacing the buildings. After patching up the gaps in the buildings, I mixed up a batch of plaster mud using paint, plaster, Mod Podge, and watering it down to a brushable consistency. Today, most of the masonry is exposed with very little of the plaster still on the walls, but originally, all of these buildings would have been covered in the adobe style of plaster, and I wanted to recreate it how it would have looked in its prime. After mixing up a batch of Sculptamold and spreading that over the whole big rock on the top, I let that dry overnight, and then it was time to add some ladders. After adding those 4 or 5 ladders, it was time to begin painting. I slapped on some gloves and broke out my airbrush, which I used for the majority of this paint job. The plaster mix was already the correct base color, so this step was mostly just changing hues and adding shading. After painting the buildings, I painted up the rocks around the outside of the cave. I did some dry brushing, I added some washes, I did some drying with the hairdryer, and then I did some more dry brushing. I finished up the paint job by painting those ladders and all of the exposed beams. I then sprinkled on a few different colors of flocking wherever it was called for, and I finished up the vegetation on the base with some miniature trees and bushes. All of this miniature foliage was sent to me as a gift from Diorama Presepe. To finish up the diorama, I painted a layer of black on every surface that needed it, and it was time to paint the minis. After cleaning up my workspace, I brought back my minis that I primed off camera with the zenithal highlight, and while I paint these, I'd like to give a shout out to all of my patrons. These miniatures are not specifically Ancestral Puebloan, but I did my best to paint them accurately to the references that I found. It was also fun to make a diorama that was more historical and domestic in nature. We don't know much about the people who lived at the Cliff Palace of Mesa Verde, but it's incredible to see the buildings they constructed on the cliff sides without the use of any modern tools or materials. If you're ever down in that part of the world, near Four Corners, this is definitely something that you should go out of your way to visit. After all of the minis had been painted, I gave them a coat of matte varnish, I dried them, and then I clipped them off their painting bases. The last thing to do was to glue all of the minis into their positions. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.